I was walking through the streets of Seoul recently, and on the surface, the city feels like it's just vibrating with energy.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got K-pop blasting from storefronts. You see these huge lines of tourists waiting for skincare. And of course, that famous blinding neon glow everywhere.
It really feels like a country at the absolute peak of its power.
Yeah, it does. But my friend, a local who's lived there his whole life, he stopped me and pointed to something. Most visitors, they just miss it. He didn't point at the crowds.
What did he point at?
The dark windows just above them. He showed me row after row of for lease signs, sort of hidden in plain sight amidst all the glamour. And he didn't describe the economy as struggling. The word he used was suffocating.
That's a strong word.
It is. He explained that while the world sees this massive cultural empire, the actual money inside the country has just stopped moving. He said it's like a blood clot.
A blood clot. That's a very vivid metaphor.
Every spare cent of capital is trapped in real estate.
It's
hoarding wealth in concrete, while the actual society, the youth, the small businesses, is just starving for liquidity.
Right.
But here is where the conversation took a truly jarring turn. I asked him, can the government fix this? Can they fix this real estate black hole?
Yeah.
And he just laughed.
He laughed.
Yeah. He said the politicians would never lower the prices because they are the ones holding all the assets. It was a deadlock of pure human greed.
Okay.
And then, with total seriousness, he offered this solution. It sounded dystopian at first, but the more I thought about it, the more terrifyingly logical it seemed.
And what was it?
He said, if humans are too greedy to save the economy, maybe we need to stop letting humans run it.
Wow.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this. That's the core tension for this deep dive. We're looking at a national economy, celebrated globally, that's now internally paralyzed by wealth hoarding, specifically in the housing market.
And this paralysis has led to a genuinely radical thought, asking if a purely rational, non-human actor, an algorithm, could be the only force capable of breaking that deadlock of human self-interest.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is connect three enormous ideas. First, the deep historical roots, the political corruption that allowed all this wealth concentration to flourish in the first place.
Then we'll look at how that historical corruption morphed into the modern, highly leveraged financial mechanisms that trap all that capital in real estate today.
And finally, we'll explore that really radical solution, space algorithmic governance. We'll examine both its promise of, neutral efficiency and the terrifying new risks it introduces.
So what we are really looking at is a journey into the political economy of wealth hoarding and corruption in advanced economies. We're using a specific context to reveal some pretty universal problems.
Problems about state capture financial mechanisms.
And the potentially utopian, but also potentially dystopian, future of governance itself.
And to really get this, to understand how to fix this financial blood clot, we can't just look at current policies.
No, absolutely not. You have to go back. You have to go back to the very foundation of the modern economic miracle, the supposed era of the efficient developmental state.
Right. Let's start there. Because for decades, the standard narrative about the spectacular, rapid economic growth in a place like South Korea was all about this idea.
The developmental state, yes. When you read the textbooks, they paint this picture of neutral technocrats, insulated from social influences, led by these austere military strongmen like Park Chung-hee.
And the idea was they were prioritizing export-oriented industrialization, making effective, rational policy decisions for the national good. It sounds great on paper.
It's the classic model, and it seemed to work. A government that is authoritarian enough to sideline internal opposition and market forces, allowing it to pick winners, provide massive public investments.
And just shepherd the economy through this rapid transformation. The civil service was supposed to be this unbiased engine of national progress.
That is the illusion. That's the story we were told.
So what was the hidden reality?
The hidden reality, which was actually, common knowledge locally, was a deep recurrent theme of massive corruption, what our sources call money politics.
Money politics.
The historical records are just filled with constant, huge scandals. You have former presidents like Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo, military officers, bankers, bureaucrats, all of them constantly entangled with massive illegal cash flows.
So people might have acted shocked when the details came out.
But the exchange of money for political influence was always an open secret. It was just woven into the fabric of that entire high-growth era.
But that raises a really critical question then. How does spectacular, globally celebrated economic growth happen despite rampant Systemic corruption.
Exactly. Isn't corruption supposed to choke off growth? That's what we're always told.
Right.
Well, the argument we have to follow here is that politics, not some neutral economic rationale, drove policymaking even during the highest growth periods. The state was developmental. It sponsored technological leaps, it provided infrastructure, it fostered investment.
But not for the reasons we thought.
Not out of purely intentional benevolence or some objective strategy. Economic policy was often the, let's say, fortunate byproduct of political actors competing intensely to gain the private benefits of state resources.
The rents, as economists call them.
Precisely. The state intervened because intervening allowed the political and business elites to manage and share those private gains. They built the highway, yes, but they also owned the toll booth.
So the state wasn't just a neutral referee. It was the source. It was the ultimate generator and distributor of wealth and risk.
It was the main source of the rents that the elites were all fighting over. To understand that dynamic, we need to get really clear on rent-seeking.
Okay, let's define that. It's not just theft.
Right. No, it's more subtle than that, though it can involve theft. Rent-seeking is basically gaining payments over and above what your resources could command in some other use. And these rents are created when the state actively intervenes to manipulate prices or markets in someone's favor.
So give me an example.
Okay, think of it this way. If a politician decides that only your company gets the license to import a high-demand foreign product, or only your firm gets access to cheap state-backed loans.
Then you get a profit margin you didn't really earn through competition.
Exactly. You didn't earn it through market efficiency, you earned it through political favor. That extra profit is the rent. And the corruption happens when the business sector uses bribery, secret funds, which are known locally as baichagam or personal connections, to influence those policy decisions and get access to those incredibly valuable rents.
And under the Park Chung-hee regime, this wasn't some hidden occasional thing.
No, it was systemic. It was the system. And it created this very specific, very stable configuration of power that kind of paradoxically explains the growth. The sources model this as Quadrant the First, a coherent state dealing with a concentrated business sector.
So a strong, centralized state and a handful of massive companies.
Yes, the state actively fostered these huge conglomerates, the Chaebol like Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo. These firms were encouraged, sometimes even required, to rush into this debt-led expansion, often overriding sound economic criteria.
And they were backed by the state with cheap capital.
Assured of it. And the more massive these Chaebol became, the more dependent the state became on their continued success. They rapidly became too big to fail.
Not just economically.
Politically, that's the key. This is the essence of what's called the mutual hostage situation.
Mutual hostage. I like that phrase.
Okay.
Because the failure of a major Chaebol would have destabilized the political regime just as much as it hurt the business leader, neither the political elites nor the economic elites could take excessive advantage of the other. The corruption was, in a strange way, constrained by their mutual need for survival.
And that constraint, weirdly enough, led to stability and high investment.
Yes, even while all these corrupt activities were happening, it was a politically managed, rapid growth model. This is institutionalized collusion, decades before the phrase "too big to fail" became, common in the West. It wasn't about pure competition or efficiency. It was about establishing political importance and managing mutual risk.
And we have actual anecdotal evidence of this, right? The coercion, the greed.
Oh, plenty. Businessmen frequently referred to their voluntary political donations as jonjose,
Which mean
quasi-taxes. This wasn't charity, it was protection money. It was the cost of ensuring the government kept the cheap credit flowing, ensuring the continued existence of their highly leveraged firms.
And there was a terrifying example of what happened if you stepped out of line.
The dismemberment of the Kupje Group in 1985. An absolutely chilling story. Kupje was, at the time, the 7th largest chaebol in the country.
So a giant.
A giant. And its president, Yang Chung-mo, made the fatal mistake of offending President Chen Du-wan by refusing to contribute a significant sum to the Ilhe Foundation.
Which is basically a slush fund.
A quasi-governmental organization used for collecting political funds, yes. And it's important to note, Kupje was not failing financially. It was generating plenty of cash flow.
But it didn't matter.
Didn't matter at all. Within weeks of Yang's refusal, the state suddenly refused to honor Kupje's checks, cut off all credit, and forced the company into bankruptcy and dismemberment. The message to the business elite was crystal clear.
The deal is stable, but obedience is mandatory.
You could expand and grow fabulously rich, but the political elite held the ultimate power to ruin you if you broke the implicit agreement.
And we should be clear, this wasn't just about complex political maneuvering to keep the economy afloat. This was also about staggering personal enrichment.
Oh, absolutely. Look at President Park's associates. When Park was assassinated in 1979, they found $500,000 in his personal safe.
In $1979.
Exactly. Look at Kim Jong-pil, a top political figure. He reportedly amassed over $50 million in assets at 1979 prices. Secret bank accounts, massive real estate holdings, an entire ranch. This wasn't just abstract distributive politics. It was outright spectacular personal greed operating right alongside and, in fact, fueling high-speed development.
So the foundation was poured decades ago. This high-growth era was driven by a politically protected elite class, constantly leveraging easy state-backed credit, paying huge quasi-taxes to keep the political machine greased, all while building tremendous personal fortunes.
That's the foundation for the capital concentration and political capture we see today.
Which brings us to the democratic transition of 1987. Now, you would think, reasonably, that moving to democracy-free press, elections, accountability would clean up this money politics.
It's the logical assumption.
But the sources we're looking at argue the complete opposite. It actually accelerated the problem.
It did. The transition fundamentally shifted the political configuration. We moved from that stable, constrained collusion of the mutual hostages dynamic.
That was quadrant one, coherent state, concentrated business.
To a new dynamic, rent-seeking predominance. Quadrant two, a fragmented state, but still a concentrated business sector.
So the state got weaker, but the Chaebol stayed strong.
Exactly. The state, now subject to democratic processes, became fractured and relatively weaker. Business now had the advantage. And the key mechanism for more corruption, not less, was the explosion in the demand for political funds.
Electoral competition is expensive.
Extremely expensive. Politicians needed even more money, more baichagam, to run campaigns, to buy votes, to simply operate political parties in a competitive landscape. The cost of winning an election just soared. Getting a National Assembly seat could require billions of won.
Can you put that in perspective? The sheer scale of the increase.
It's staggering. The total estimated quasi-taxes demanded from just the 10 largest Chaebol jumped from about 3.9 billion won in the early 80s under the authoritarian regime to over 4.2 trillion won in the mid-90s in the democratic era.
A 1,000-fold increase.
The national economy did not expand 1,000 times in that period, but the political demand for cash certainly did.
And this demand spread the poison deeper into the system.
It did. Under authoritarian rule, you paid the guy at the top, and things generally moved. The top official eliminated the middleman, but by the late 80s and 90s, the bureaucracy itself was fractured by political competition. It wasn't one coherent decision maker anymore.
So more people had their hands out.
Many more. There's this one quote from a businessman who lamented that under the new democracy, he needed over 100 envelopes, meaning bribes, just to build a factory. He said that level of bureaucratic interference and low-level rent-seeking just hadn't existed under the strongman regimes.
Every small bureaucrat suddenly had veto power.
Which created an opportunity for corruption at every single level, slowing down legitimate processes and raising the cost of everything. The result was inevitable. Business gained far greater influence over policy.
And the strategic allocation of economic policy became the main political resource to keep the campaign funds flowing.
Exactly. The concentration of wealth just continued. The 4 largest Chaebol increased their value-added share of GNP from 5.7% in 1986 to 9.3% in 1995. This deeply entrenched psychopolitical connections and baichagam rewarding debt-led overexpansion over real efficiency created the massive financial vulnerabilities that would eventually manifest, not just in corporate bailouts, but in the modern housing crisis.
So the groundwork for today's national blood clot was laid through decades of these intimate, corrupt, and ultimately self-serving relationships between the state and these powerful elites.
That historical context is absolutely critical because it lets us transition from state capture by the Chaebol to modern capture, where the financial system itself and the housing market become the new engine of wealth hoarding.
Right. So if part one was about corruption securing cheap credit for corporations,
part two is about corruption securing financial leverage and capital immobility for individual households. And what's fascinating here is how the historical failure of the state to provide universal welfare links directly to the current asset bubble and this crippling national debt.
So how did housing become the main channel for this?
For Korean households, the function of housing just fundamentally changed over the last few decades. It was driven by stagnant real wages and, crucially, the historical absence of a robust universal welfare system. The state had effectively outsourced that social burden to the private sector.
So housing became the only way for people to secure their own financial stability.
It became the core institution of what the sources call asset-based welfare. A home is no longer just a place to live. It has morphed into a retirement plan, a security blanket against job loss, and the main vehicle for accumulating capital.
The exchange value, what you can sell it or borrow against it for, has completely overridden its use value.
Entirely. And the scale of this capital concentration is what explains your friend's blood clot metaphor so perfectly. Real estate assets account for a colossal 71.5% of total household asset composition.
71.5%. That's almost 3/4 of the nation's household wealth.
Locked into physical real estate. So when you need capital mobility for innovation, for small business investment, for productivity, having 3/4 of your assets immobilized in concrete is catastrophic.
And that's what's driving the crushing debt problem.
Overwhelmingly. Korea's household debt is led by housing-related loans. But the problem is even deeper than traditional mortgages. When you factor in the private debt structure, and we're going to get into the massive Jonesy deposit system, the total household debt is estimated at nearly 3,000 trillion won.
Can you put that number into context? It's hard to grasp.
It is. It's 156.8% of GDP. And it's an eye-watering 303.7% of household net disposable income.
3 times what households actually have to spend.
By this measure, Koreans may well be the most indebted people in the developed world. And you see the immediate connection to the opening story. The money is physically there, but it's completely trapped, supporting a debt-fueled asset price bubble that cannot be allowed to pop.
So let's get into the mechanics. How are households able to engage in speculation on this massive scale? And you mentioned the state assists with this.
Yes, and the first mechanism is the pre-sale system known as Cheongyak.
Okay, so this was originally designed to provide affordable housing, but it became a speculation tool. How does it work?
The system emerged because initially neither the state nor the private sector had enough upfront cash for rapid construction during the high-growth era. So developers started selling apartments before construction was even complete, often just based on blueprints.
So the buyer's paying for something that doesn't exist yet.
Yes. The buyer pays 70 to 90% of the price in installments over the 2 to 3 years of construction. The buyer is literally acting as a short-term financier. They're funding the construction, minimizing the developer's need to borrow.
But why would a buyer agree to take on that risk? What's the incentive?
The key incentive is the guaranteed state-sanctioned capital gain. Historically, the state capped these pre-sale prices below the estimated market value of the finished apartment.
So if you win the lottery to buy one, you've instantly made money.
A huge amount. It's an immediate, significant capital gain the moment you get the keys. It's essentially a subsidized, high-stakes, government-sponsored lottery for guaranteed profit. And naturally, this attracted high-income households looking for that guaranteed profit, which completely defeated the original goal of housing the poor.
And the state's role goes even deeper than just setting the price cap.
Much deeper. The state plays this incredibly powerful financial role by centralizing massive amounts of household savings through this very system. To even be eligible to bid in this lucrative pre-sale lottery, you have to hold a specific savings account, the Cheongyak account.
And all that money goes where?
The regulations dictate that the massive funds accumulated in these accounts, we're talking 95 trillion won, must be concentrated into the state-run National Housing and Urban Fund, or NHUF.
95 trillion won. That's a staggering amount of household savings that the state directly controls.
And mobilizes. The NHUF then acts like a giant state-backed financial institution. It lends money back to construction companies, it offers cheap loans to households, and, crucially, it invests considerable amounts directly into financial markets, REITs, short-term securities. This is state-led financialization of housing, using the nation's household savings as its capital base.
But you said this system also creates a dangerous liquidity trap. How does that work?
Well, the bidding process is governed by a point system, and this system rewards households for maintaining large sums locked in that Cheongyak account for long periods. If you withdraw the money, you lose your accumulated points.
You lose your eligibility to participate in the lottery in the future.
Exactly. So if you're a middle-class family and you urgently need cash, you're in a terrible position.
Wait, so they'll borrow against their own savings account? That sounds incredibly inefficient.
It is extremely inefficient, and it perfectly illustrates the financial paralysis. In 2022, the state-set deposit rate on the Chianyak account was a tiny 1.8%, but the interest rate for a secured loan borrowing against that same collateral ranged up to 6.65%.
So people are paying 6% interest to access cash that's sitting in an account, only earning them 1.8%.
They're willing to endure that substantial financial loss because losing their points and their eligibility for the presale lottery is perceived as losing a vital, subsidized future asset. The system is designed to ensure capital remains immobile and trapped, feeding the asset bubble rather than lubricating the broader economy.
Wow. Okay, so that's Chiangyak, which traps capital through this point system. But you also mentioned the Jiangxi system, which you called the engine of extreme leverage.
Yes, and this mechanism is highly unique and absolutely critical to understanding the depth of the crisis. It enables massive wealth accumulation, often entirely outside the conventional banking system.
So explain how Gene works. It's a deposit-only rental agreement.
That's right. Typically for 2 years. The tenant gives the landlord a massive lump sum deposit, historically around 70% of the property's sale price, and in exchange, they pay no monthly rent.
And at the end of the 2 years, they get the deposit back.
In full, assuming no damage to the property. So for the tenant, they live rent-free for 2 years, but for the landlord,
they get an interest-free private loan equivalent to 70% of the property's value. That sounds like an incredible deal for the landlord.
it is cost-free private capital. That is the critical point. For the landlord, this lump sum can be immediately invested for profit in the stock market or, more commonly, used to purchase another property. By continuously rolling over the deposit with a new tenant every 2 years, the landlord effectively maintains this cost-free capital indefinitely. No interest payments to a bank.
And this gives rise to something called gap investment.
The infamous GAP. This is how extreme leverage occurs without the heavy regulation you'd see with a traditional mortgage. An investor only needs to pay the gap, the difference between the property's market value and the Johnson deposit, to acquire the asset.
So if the deposit is 70% of the value, you only need 30% of the capital.
Exactly. With the average Johnson to sale ratio often around 67%, an asset can be obtained with only about 1/3 of its value as initial capital. This allows an investor to buy 3 houses for the price of 1, using private, interest-free loans provided by their tenants. This is debt-led speculation at its most highly leveraged.
The obvious risk, of course, is that the tenant expects their deposit back in 2 years. This all works beautifully as long as property prices keep rising.
That's the ticking bomb. As long as prices rise, the landlord can find a new tenant willing to pay an even higher deposit, or just sell the property for a profit and pay back the original tenant.
But that's where the systemic risk comes in. What happens when prices fall?
It's catastrophic. Landlords who relied entirely on refinancing with a new, higher deposit from a new tenant suddenly can't return the original deposit because the market value, and thus the feasible deposit amount, has dropped.
And that triggers a massive liquidity crunch.
Widespread tenant distress, foreclosures, mass displacement. And the state's response to this crisis, the reverse Johnny's policy, is perhaps the most desperate attempt to prop up this failing structure.
What does that policy do?
When the crisis hits, the government often responds by offering Johnson deposit return loans for the struggling landlords.
So they're lending more money to people who are already indebted beyond their means of recovery.
Precisely. Just to ensure the tenants get their deposits back and the whole system doesn't implode, you're injecting public funds to socialize the risk created by private speculation. The sources explicitly compare this failure mechanism and the governmental response to the Eurozone crisis.
But applied not to multinational banks, but to individual households.
A systematic failure perpetuated by institutionalized, state-backed debt structured around the housing market.
So we have the historical corruption that fostered concentrated capital, and now these modern mechanisms of debt and leverage. Who is actually playing this game now? And what's the social consequence for the next generation?
Well, the conventional wisdom often suggests that it's young people drowning themselves in excessive debt just to join the speculation race. But the data presents a far more specific and, frankly, more depressing picture. It's really about deep intergenerational inequity.
How so?
Recent data shows that young buyers, those in their 20s and 30s, accounted for 55% of first-time house purchases. They're the leading age group, so that naturally suggests massive debt.
Right, that's what you'd assume.
However, researchers who analyzed the reality found that most of the successful young buyers are not the ones using excessive debt, which they define as a debt-to-income ratio over 40%. Instead, they're winning the race because they're using sufficient personal funds.
Or, and this is the key part,
Or they are receiving parental support that far exceeds tax-free limits. So the housing market isn't being won by highly indebted strivers. It's being won by the wealthy and the upper middle class who are liquidating or leveraging their parents' established assets.
do we have specific data on that?
We do. It's startling. Over 7,000 buyers in their 30s, for instance, received transfers exceeding $150 million won. That's about $110,000 from their family. The older generation, the 50s and 60s crowd, is actively involved in this. They see purchasing a small sole apartment for their children as providing a basic safety net.
A safety net for an uncertain future, especially given what you said about the state's failure to provide robust universal welfare.
They are essentially privatizing the social safety net. They're using concrete assets as the only reliable form of intergenerational insurance they can count on.
And this has immediate, damaging consequences for social mobility and the broader economy.
Of course, it fuels this sharp disparity within the younger generation. Those with parental support win, cementing their status. Those without are permanently locked out of this asset-based welfare system.
And critically, it locks immense wealth into non-productive real estate, preventing that capital from flowing into more innovative sectors.
And that's the direct link. The historical political corruption that favored concentration of wealth in Part 1 connects directly to the modern financial capture in Part 2, cementing the economic deadlock we started this deep dive talking about.
The capital is trapped, not because of some unavoidable market slump, but because of decades of state policies twisted by elite self-interest and then adopted by entire generations desperate for a private safety net.
Which brings us right back to your friend's radical proposal. If the system is designed to reward human greed and perpetuate this cycle of debt and immobility, maybe the only solution is to remove the human element entirely.
Exactly. This is the central tension we opened with. If humans are too greedy, maybe we stop letting humans run the system. This leads us directly to this radical solution space of AI governance, or algocracy.
And given the systemic, deeply entrenched nature of the human corruption and rent-seeking we just documented, the appeal of a purely rational non-human actor is, well, profoundly understandable.
The core promise is neutrality. Objective data processing, policy enforcement unburdened by self-interest, political capture, or the need to amass by Chaebol.
But is this just theoretical sci-fi, or is this actually happening now in government?
It is very much happening, often quietly, but the trend is accelerating. AI and algorithms are already being experimented with in many agencies globally. A study of U.S. federal agencies showed that 45% had experimented with AI or machine learning tools by 2020.
And this includes some pretty sophisticated applications, right?
Yes, in places like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is tasked with market regulation, and the FDA. And specifically regarding our topic, fighting corruption and enhancing transparency algorithms, offer a technological solution to what is a deeply political problem.
Are there tangible examples of this?
There are. We see things like Ukraine utilizing blockchain for government auctions, specifically to ensure transparency and hinder corruption in governmental transactions. The logic is that the technology itself enforces the rules and the audit trail, not a potentially corruptible official.
So it's a direct technological challenge to that endemic money politics that fueled the rise of the Chaebol.
Precisely. And this goal of pure, impartial efficiency is being pursued even in the judiciary. China has created a virtual AI judge to handle high-volume, repetitive, basic work, freeing up human judges for more complex trials.
And Estonia is doing something similar, I believe?
Yes. Demonstrating similar aspirations for speed and impartiality, they're planning to use AI to decide small claim cases of less than 7,000 euros. The theoretical benefit is clear. Massive efficiency and total integrity in areas where human emotion, bias, political pressure, or just plain greed often fail.
So for a country paralyzed by self-serving elites who refuse to lower asset prices, a politically neutral, data-driven algorithm could theoretically reallocate capital, burst speculative bubbles, and restructure the economy based on maximum national productivity.
And it wouldn't be concerned with election cycles or personal bank accounts.
However, and this is a big however, The sources really stress that this shift from human fallibility to algorithmic efficiency introduces terrifying new risks. This isn't just a trade of old problems for new technology.
It's a trade of human scale, personal corruption for systemic, machine scale failure.
Exactly. The core risks are severe. If an algorithm is trained on historical data, and that data reflects decades of political corruption, social bias, historical rent-seeking, everything we just documented in Part 1.
Then the algorithm won't eliminate the bias.
It will institutionalize it. It will bake in historical biases of gender, wealth, and region at an immense, irreversible scale.
And that's the mechanism through which algorithms and big data are suspected of actually accelerating inequality.
Yes, they operate within this fundamental lack of transparency, the black box problem, where the decision-making process is inscrutable, even to the programmers. And this opacity makes accountability impossible when mistakes occur at a vast scale.
And you have to assume the powerful regulated parties, the Chaebol, the financial elites, the wealthy asset hoarders, they're not just going to stand back and accept pure neutrality.
Not a chance. They will adapt their rent-seeking behavior. There is a very serious concern about gaming the system. Once an algorithm's operational parameters become somewhat known, regulated parties will try to manipulate outcomes in their favor.
Using things like adversarial machine learning to trick the system.
Exactly, tricking it into granting them rents or licenses unfairly. It would just become a technological arms race between the state and the economic elites, a kind of sophisticated digital money politics.
And there's a more disturbing political risk here, too. The potential for what some have called infinitely stable dictatorships.
Right. The historian Yuval Harari argues that the conflict between democracy and dictatorship can be seen as a conflict of two different data processing systems. AI allows enormous amounts of information to be processed centrally,
Which could lead to a highly stable, non-human controlled dictatorship that knows everything about its citizens' economic conditions, their housing status, their political leanings. If an algorithm is making all the decisions for the common good, is democracy even necessary?
And public acceptance of this is incredibly volatile. We saw a striking real-world failure of this in the UK in 2020.
With the exam results algorithm?
Right. An algorithm was used to assign exam results during the pandemic. When the decisions were deemed unfair and biased against students from disadvantaged backgrounds, it sparked massive public protest under the banner, "Fuck the algorithm."
And the grades had to be reversed.
They did. It shows that public confidence evaporates instantly when algorithmic decisions lack perceived fairness, regardless of how efficient they might claim to be.
So simply trading human greed and fallibility for cold, opaque efficiency is not sufficient. It just trades one type of systemic failure and capture for another.
And the intellectual response to this dilemma is the move toward what's called human-centric AI, or HCAI.
The goal here has to move far beyond just efficiency or achieving minimum human rights.
The aim has to be technological emancipation, promoting human well-being and the common good in a systemic way.
So where do current policy approaches fall short of that goal?
Well, current concepts often risk being a failed adaptation of traditional user-centered design from the software world. By limiting citizens to the narrow role of users, these policy concepts ignore the broader political, ethical, and societal impacts.
Like how AI reinforces power structures or its massive environmental cost.
Exactly. This reduction often leads to what's called ethics washing, claiming to adhere to ethical guidelines without fundamentally changing the power dynamics or the entrenched status quo, like the housing speculation deadlock we've been talking about.
The core realization, then, is that we need a systemic view that looks far beyond just the immediate interaction of a person and a machine.
To be truly human-centered, governance has to expand from just user-centeredness to include community-centeredness and society-centeredness. This systemic approach ensures that we account for the long-term socio-technical, political, and economic impacts, aiming to prevent the kind of asset capture we saw evolve in parts 1 and 2.
And the systemic approach requires certain pillars to function, right? To act as guardrails against algorithmic capture or dictatorship.
Yes, 4 key pillars. The first is mutual trust. And trust is always context-tied. To trust the system must demonstrate technical robustness, clear explainability, transparency, and accountability.
On both the technical level, the code, and the organizational level, meaning who programs and operates it.
Precisely. If an algorithm were to manage housing prices, citizens would need to understand exactly how the input data debt levels, local wages, translates to the final price decision. The black box must be illuminated.
Okay, that's trust. What's the second pillar?
The second is mutuality. This is an ethical organizing principle based on interdependence, equity, and participation. It means ensuring that the needs and interests of all the diverse stakeholders—
So young people locked out of the market, the indebted landlords, the small business owners, starved of capital—
that their needs are met. It moves beyond control hierarchies dictated by the powerful. AI can only be trusted if it's seen as serving the broadest common good, not just the technical interests of the programmer or the political interests of the regime.
And the third?
Third, communication and transparency are explicit essential requirements. Open, cross-disciplinary dialogue is vital to prevent oppression, exploitation, and disinformation. There must be an informed public debate about what the algorithm is doing and why.
So we avoid a situation like the UK exam algorithm, where failure is just blamed on a faceless machine, sparking a backlash.
Explicit communication ensures the power of AI is channeled responsibly.
And the final pillar?
Finally, we need civic tech tools that enable broad-scale participation. Technologies like the V-Taiwan project offer successful models for integrating open consultation and crowdsourcing with actual legislative action.
So it's a bottom-up process. It aligns technology with democratic institutions.
It allows citizens to actively co-develop policy rather than being passive users subject to automated decisions. This participatory element is crucial for preventing the system from being captured by the very elites the algorithms were meant to bypass.
So the solution to the deadlock of human greed isn't to simply fire the humans and hire the algorithms.
No. It's to use algorithms as tools within a far more robust, transparent, and participatory governance structure than we currently possess. The idea is to promote enlightened communication, mutuality, inclusiveness, and transparency in dynamic processes that integrate society and citizens.
To ensure that these non-human systems serve the broadest common good, not just the powerful interests that program or own the technology.
Exactly.
So we started this deep dive with the question of whether humans are too greedy to run a stable economy, which led to that radical call for algorithmic neutrality to break this deadlock of wealth hoarding and political capture.
And we found that the economic deadlock, that blood clot of capital trapped in real estate, is a highly leveraged, state-sanctioned scheme. It's rooted in decades of political corruption and now perpetuated by desperate asset transfers across generations.
The problem is deeply human and structurally embedded in the financialized housing system through these mechanisms like Chongyak and Jauncey.
And while AI offers a theoretical escape valve, pure, impartial efficiency, it introduces its own terrifying new risks. Bias at scale, lack of accountability in the black box, and the potential for a digital dictatorship.
So the decision to hand over governance isn't a simple choice between efficiency and corruption.
No, it's a complex trade-off between human fallibility and cold, powerful, and opaque computation.
And to avoid simply trading one form of capture by greedy elites for another by opaque algorithms, the focus has to shift to crafting a truly human-centric system.
Which means building governance that is deliberate, transparent, and inclusive, ensuring that non-human systems serve the broadest common good, not just the interests of those who program or own the technology.
So the fundamental political challenge isn't just developing advanced algorithms to eliminate human decision-making.
It's developing political institutions that are robust enough to govern the algorithms themselves to prevent new forms of systemic, incorruptible, and irreversible failure.